And exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me, that I will not be silent when Israel commits crimes against the Palestinians. Can you elaborate a little bit on the lessons that your parents taught you? How has the experience of your mother and father as Nazi Holocaust survivors influenced your work?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me here. It's a big crowd, which is pleasant to see and makes it encouraging for me. Let me just make sure people in the very back that you hear me okay, raise your hand. Okay, so sound is fine. Usually that takes about a half hour to get right, so people here are on the ball. Thank you for that. In answer to the question that was just asked, to explain the lessons that my parents taught me, sometimes unintentionally, just through their words, but not necessarily directed at me. Maybe I'll just give one example, which I was thinking about lately. I grew up in a lower middle class, lower middle class, very ambitious Jewish neighborhood. People came from pretty humble beginnings, not as humble as most of the people in this room, but still modest beginnings. And now they were, not they, but their children, my generation, they were ready to make it in American society. They were very determined to make it. They were very, very ambitious. When I went to school, there were very, very few, as we call them, girls, because we're talking about 6th grade, who went into the professions. When I went into school, the most a woman could strive to, the peak, was to be a public school teacher. That had its advantages because we had a lot of very smart public school teachers, women, but that's only because they couldn't become doctors or lawyers or professors. Well, my generation, things began to change for women, and because I came from this lower middle class, very ambitious Jewish neighborhood, the girls, if I look back now at my 6th grade class picture, it's very hard to believe more than half the girls in the class became medical doctors. That's how ambitious they were. Most of my friends were very, very successful by conventional standards in life. Not just physicians, but physicians at the top of their field. So, lower middle class, ambitious, and when you're in that kind of neighborhood, people care a lot about what's called property values. And property values can go up or down by virtue of who moves in the neighborhood. If it's an all-white Jewish neighborhood and a black family moves in, and you live next door, property values go through the floor. Well, they were planning on building, one year they announced, we're building a homeless shelter in your neighborhood. It's a long, long time ago. We're talking about 40 years ago, even more, 45 years ago. They're going to build a homeless shelter. And my mother was as sensitive as anybody when it came to property values, because your house was everything. It was your investment, it was your neighborhood. I was very surprised, pleasantly surprised. She said, she came out publicly, build the homeless shelter. I thought to myself, my mother build a homeless shelter? My mother with the property values thing? And I wondered why. And she said, you never know where you will be tomorrow. Now, most people didn't understand what she was saying, but I immediately understood. You never know where you will be tomorrow. She grew up in Poland. She was in the Polish middle class, went to private school, was the president of her school, and had a wonderful life in her youth. After school, she said, I never studied. I threw my books away, and I went ice skating. And at night, it was always classical music concerts. She was very smart, much more so than me. Ended up studying mathematics at Warsaw University. She went there in 1937. Suddenly, in 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland in September. In the blink of an eye, literally, the blink of an eye, her whole world had turned upside down. She was a member of the Polish middle class, president of her school, attending Warsaw University, a woman, a Jewish woman, studying mathematics, and then overnight, she turned into garbage. She smelled like a homeless person. She was homeless like a homeless person. Everyone around her was not figuratively, was literally dying from hunger. You walk the streets, and there are all these corpses littering the streets of people who literally died from hunger. And the lesson was, don't be smug that you'll never end up like that, because you never know where you will be tomorrow. And I remember her telling me, just as a side note, she said her relatives were not very generous to her during that terrible period. At the end, every member of her family was exterminated, and both my mother and my father's side. I never had an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a grandmother, a grandfather, nothing. Everybody was exterminated, except my mother on her side and my father on his side. But during the Warsaw Ghetto, which came before the extermination camps, she had some relatives, an aunt here, an uncle there, a cousin there, and she said they didn't treat her very well. But towards the end, the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, to protect themselves, they built what were called bunkers, which were just like underground caves, catacombs throughout the whole ghetto to protect themselves from the Nazis when it was clear that everybody was going to be wiped out. And she said once, by accident, she ended up in the bunker of the prostitutes in the ghetto and the truck drivers. The prostitutes and the truck drivers. She said they treated her the best. They were the most generous. So you never know where you'll be tomorrow, and you never know who your real friends are in the world. Those are important lessons for me. And there's also the lesson, you never know where you're going to meet the kindest and the most generous and the most decent people. And I have a feeling I met one of them, and I met Mr. Haas today, Professor Haas, at the train station. It doesn't take me very long at this point in my life and my experience in life to size up a person. I just need a few words, a few sentences to figure out whether I'm with a good egg or a bad egg. Somebody who's too proud, or somebody who maybe is just a little bit too humble. I have the good fortune, as I, not with great frequency, but with more frequency than I meet a lot of good people. That was the last lesson, and I'll leave it at that. I learned from my late mother. Once I was speaking publicly with her. I was speaking in Israel and Palestine, and she was speaking of the Nazis and the Jews. Jewish people love to hear what my mother had to say. They kind of hated what I had to say. But once I remember a student in the room like this raised his or her hand, I can't remember if it was a male or female, and asked the question, okay, what's the main lesson you learned from the Nazi Holocaust? What's the main lesson you learned? And without missing a beat, without a blink of an eye, I remember my mother's answer. She was very firm. She said, in this world, there are good people and there are bad people. And that's it. Don't talk to me. I knew again exactly what she meant. Don't talk to me about Jews versus Goyim or black versus white or Muslim versus Jewish. Those distinctions make no difference. There are a lot of really nasty, rotten Jews who we can do without, and there are a lot of very nice, decent non-Jews in the world. It's good and bad, and that's it. And that's my experience in life. So I didn't ask John if he's Jewish or not, but I know he's in a good column.
All right. I have a couple of questions that I think are kind of late, and I want to get through these questions so that the audience has a chance to ask. But one of the things that really was of interest to me, that people have often said that you were obsessed with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I believe that on June 6, 1982, you had a little bit of an epiphany. And I know that it was, what, at the age of 28 or 29 that you came to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you were interested in other issues. Prior to that, Vietnam, you were interested in the civil rights movement, you were interested in Central America. There's a lot of issues that people seldom really speak about. But one of the things that I found very interesting, and I was really moved by this, when you were reading the Joan Peters from Time Immemorial, and I wonder if you could take the audience through that a little bit. I remember you rushed down to the bookstore to read it. The book was said it was going to change the whole world out there. And I remember you talking about it, that you went at it after that, like Captain Ahab and Moby Dick. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in this conflict.
Well, there are two aspects to it. It's sort of the personal, political side of me, and then sort of the intellectual side of me. I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can to give you all time to speak. I was involved in politics from an early age, I'd say about 15 or 16, which in the 1960s was not unusual. High schools already were very politicized in that generation. It was not just college. I was in junior in high school when Kent State happened, the killing of 4 students in 1970 in Kent State. And our school was big. It was, each class had about 1,000 students. All 4,000 students walked out of school and demonstrated around the school. That was high school. It was not unusual at all. I was active. The only thing that I think made me a little bit different, not to toot my own horn, but just to clarify where I'm coming from, when John just used the word, you were interested in Vietnam. I was not interested in Vietnam. I was kind of hysterical about Vietnam. No, it was. I just came from a home which was not passionately anti-war. It was hysterically anti-war. In our home, if you talk rationally about war, as in you have a debate about war, then there is something wrong with you. War is not something you rationally sit around and just debate and argue about. War is death. War is people who mean everything in the world to you. Suddenly, they're gone forever. So I remember once I was reading a book in Vietnam. It was called Conversations with Americans. Don't ask how I remember these things, but I do. My short-term memory is terrible. I can tell you everything that happened in every minute of every day when I was 40 years ago in school. And it was describing the tortures that were being inflicted on Vietnamese by American soldiers. And it just sort of shredded me inside. And I went over to a very close friend of mine. Her name was Meryl Ledenter. And I said, Meryl, you have to read this. You have to see this. And I started to read it to her. And I remember her answer was, yeah, that's terrible, hold on. And she just walked away. And I knew at just that moment it was just something that I was really different than the people around me. I grew up in a different kind of home. You couldn't do that. So I was involved in the war in Vietnam, civil rights movement, a lot with the farm workers. The UFW at the time would say to Chavez, the slogans were like, give the contracts back to the farm workers. You go in front of the liquor stores to get them to stop selling I can tell you the slogan. It was Flatbush Liquors, we say no, Scab Gallo has got to go. It was Gallo wine, which was breaking the boycott of Cesar Chavez. So I was very involved in that. And then in the early 80s, I was very involved in Central America. I taught at a free school for refugees from, mostly it was at that time El Salvador, a little bit less Guatemala, really nothing from Nicaragua, because the problem was not refugees, the problem was the war, the invasion. So I was very involved in that. And then only quite late in life, in 1982, did Israel-Palestine come on my political radar when Israel invaded Lebanon in June 1982. I became involved. And the thing was, I had been, nobody here in this room will understand it because it's from an ancient era. I had been this thing called a Maoist, which is a follower of Chairman Mao in China. How many people even know who Chairman Mao is? Raise your hand.
My class better.
Not bad. So it was our credo by which we lived was Mao Zedong, live like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. That's how I grew up, nutty, I know. And a lot of my beliefs about China, they were shattered after Mao Zedong died, and we realized, no, it was not quite the way we thought it would be. And so I became very cautious about politics because I so deeply believed in it, and I was so sure of myself that after my illusions were shattered, I was so humiliated because it turned out that I was so self-confident and so sure and telling everybody that you don't know what you're talking about, I know the truth. And then it turned out, no, they were right, largely right, and I was largely wrong. And I was physically ill for about 3 weeks. I mean, I couldn't get out of bed. I was so humiliated by my stupidity. And I was determined at that point, this is never going to happen again. So when along came the Israel-Palestine conflict, I had done a lot of reading on the subject, and it eventually became my doctoral dissertation, what you have to write in order to get your title PhD, which in my case was useless in life, but that's beside the point. Just as I was finishing the doctoral dissertation, and I was very strongly at that time, the expression back then, which I wouldn't use now, pro-Palestinian, and then along comes a book by this author named Joan Peters, and she said, well, there's no such thing as Palestinians, the whole thing is a fake. The Jews came to Palestine, the whole area was empty. They brought all their ingenuity, they brought all their talent, and they made the desert bloom. And then all of these Arabs from neighboring countries, they flocked into Palestine to take advantage of all the new economic opportunities that the Jews had created. So, I'm a part of the political left. The political left is pro-Palestinian.